My name is Lorah Steichen, and I work for the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. And at the National Priorities Project, we conduct research and produce analysis on the federal budget and on military spending. And so, as probably everybody that's on this webinar already knows, the U.S. military claims a huge percentage of the discretionary budget that Congress allocates every year, while programs that are critical to actually meeting people's needs and keeping people safe. I'm thinking about programs that we might use to manage a global pandemic or to address the climate crisis, for example, get pennies by comparison. So as Nick said, in my role at NPP, I'm really focused on producing research and analysis to draw out some of the many intersections between climate and militarism and support movement building across both movements. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Looks good?
Looks
okay.
Good.
Great. So today I'd like to share the findings of a new report from the National Priorities Project that we released this year on Earth Day. It's called NoWarming, NoWar, How Militarism Fuels the Climate Crisis and Vice Versa. In this report, we lay out the ways that militarism and the climate crisis intersect and are mutually reinforcing, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So climate change and militarism intersect in a variety of alarming ways. Many of these are been brought up and worked on by the working group that's hosting this webinar, and I'll go through them in my presentation. The first one is that the Pentagon is a major polluter and contributes significantly to the climate crisis. The second one is that the United States has a well-known history of fighting wars for oil, and the fossil fuel industry also relies on militarization to uphold its operations around the globe. Next is that climate change and border militarization are inextricably linked. Overinvestment in the military comes at the high cost of underinvesting in other needs, including climate action. The next one is that workers in both the military and fossil fuel sectors need a way out. We need a just transition for workers and communities in both sectors. And finally, what's evident across all of these findings is that racism and racial oppression form the foundation for the fossil-fueled and militarized economies, and neither could exist without the presumption that some human lives are worth more than others. So that last one, I really want us to just ground in this conversation and think about throughout the key findings that we'll go through. So I'm sorry if this framework is a little bit hard to read for folks. It's one of the things that we'll be sure to share in the follow-up materials. But I'd really like to frame our discussion today within the context of the just transition framework that many are probably already familiar with. This was developed by a group called Movement Generation and is very popular in the climate justice movement. The just transition is a process of transforming an unjust, extractive economy that exploits and harms people and the planet. That's the economy we have now, to a just, regenerative economy with healthy, thriving communities and ecosystems. That's the living economy that we really need. And again, it might be kind of hard to see, but militarism is really the coercive arm of the extractive economy. It's there on the bottom under the extractive economy, and militarism is really what governs the extractive economy. People have always resisted the exploitation of the extractive economy. It's built on business models that are in opposition to healthy human life. But violence and the threat of violence are really what keep this economic system in operation. And as we'll talk about today, this plays out on a global scale. The military yields such power globally militarized violent policing, employ brute force against communities within the United States, and immigration enforcement violently patrol national borders, sort of at the nexus of the international and the domestic. So the first point we make in the report is that the Pentagon is a major polluter. The U.S. military, as probably everybody listening knows, has extensive infrastructure both domestically and abroad. And so it probably doesn't come as a huge surprise that the largest industrial military in the history of the world is also among the biggest polluters. The U.S. military produces about as much greenhouse gases in any given year as some entire industrialized countries do. For example, about the same amount of emissions as countries like Denmark and Sweden produce in a year. The Pentagon is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum. Just one of the military's jets, the B-52 Stratofortress, consumes about as much fuel in 1 hour as the average car driver uses in 7 years. So if you have a car that you use to get around, the amount of fuel that you produce in 7 years is the equivalent that the Stratofortress produces in 1 hour. Next, the United States has a really well-known history of fighting wars for oil. Oil is the leading cause of interstate war and accounts for roughly half of all interstate wars in recent decades. A pretty significant part of the hundreds of billions of dollars spent on the Pentagon every year goes towards defending the world's oil supplies. Research suggests that the military spends at least $81 billion every year defending the world's oil supplies. And what that really means is just sort of code for protecting oil supplies globally from other countries and ensuring access for the United States. The fossil fuel industry also relies on militarization, like I said before when we were looking at the Just Transition framework, to uphold its operations around the globe. So this results not only in wars, but also in militarized responses to resistance. So all over the world, those who fight to protect their land from extractive industries are met with state and paramilitary violence. We also know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately targeted by this militarized violence. At least 3 people are killed every week around the world for defending their land and water. And Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by this violence. While Indigenous people make up about 5% of the global population, they account for about a quarter of those murdered for defending their land and the environment. And we see this play out right here in the United States, for example, with militarized responses to Indigenous-led pipeline protests. And these populations that are fighting against the exploitation of extractive industries like the fossil fuel industry are increasingly characterized as eco-terrorists, sometimes just straight up terrorists. And so we see the language used to justify war and military aggression abroad used to target those who resist the domination and the exploitation of the fossil fuel economy. It's also worth noting that local police forces acquire military-grade equipment through a Department of Defense program called the 1033 program that gives riot gear, weaponized vehicles, and other military equipment to local police forces. Next is that climate change and border militarization are inextricably linked. So we know that climate change is already compounding existing conflicts and instabilities and causing more conflict and more political instability. And the result of this is that we will see unprecedented numbers of dislocated people. Estimates project that around 200 million people will be displaced by the middle of the century due to the impacts of climate change. And some estimates project even higher levels of displacement and migration, sometimes as high as 1 billion is predicted by 2050. And we already see this happening. Between 2008 and 2015, an average of 21 million people were displaced annually from the impacts and threats of climate-related hazards. So we're already seeing this play out, and particularly people in the global south are already experiencing these impacts. So many of us are probably aware of climate migration, but we don't necessarily hear the federal government talking about this too often. But the Pentagon has actually been planning for climate migration for decades. In a 2003 report, for example, the Pentagon describes the fortressing of America to prevent what the report describes as, quote, unwanted starving immigrants, unquote, from the global south from entering the United States. So we see pretty overtly xenophobic language employed by the Pentagon in reference to people who are displaced by the climate crisis. And what we see is that around the globe, governments are tending not to respond to this growing problem with solidarity and with sharing of resources, but actually governments are allocating more of their budgets, not just the United States, but governments around the world, to build walls, to hire armed guards, and to militarize borders to keep migrants out. In the United States, the U.S. Border and Immigration Enforcement has undergone pretty unprecedented escalations, military escalations in particular, since that last report I just referenced was published. The border has been described by some as an imagined war zone, and a bloated border budget, militarized border budget, funds increasing numbers of armed border patrol agents and surveillance technologies, including drones. Customs and Border Protection has the largest U.S. drone fleet of any kind outside of the U.S. Department of Defense, including Predator B drones that were built for military use, but that CBP has been using since 2006. These drones are incredibly costly. They run around $17 million each, and they cost $32,000 every single time they're used to apprehend an individual. I think something that I really want to make sure that we're thinking about as we talk about border militarization, especially as it relates to the southern border of the United States, is that the U.S. is responsible for more greenhouse gas pollution than any other country since the Industrial Revolution. And so having played such a significant role in causing the climate crisis, the United States bears a disproportionate share of the responsibility to address it. And a part of that is a debt to displaced people around the world who predominantly have done relatively little to contribute to the climate crisis. So next, I want to talk about the budget and military spending. I think anyone who works on climate knows that proposals to meaningfully address the climate crisis, which will require a significant level of public investment, are often characterized as unrealistic pipe dreams, right? Like we all know this tired refrain of, that sounds great, but how are you going to pay for it, right? But we also know that this same scrutiny is almost never applied to military spending. And the reality is there is no shortage of funds or resources to fund a just transition to the green economy. We're now spending over $700 billion every year on the military. The military budget in 2020 was 272 times larger than the federal budget for energy efficiency and renewable energy. We also know that the Pentagon, the military budget, is a huge portion of the discretionary budget, but when we expand that to encompass all forms of militarized spending, which includes immigration enforcement, which includes incarceration, things of this nature, we're adding tens of billions of dollars in spending on top of the traditional military spending every year. So compared to the $6.4 trillion that we've spent on war in the past 2 decades, the cost of shifting the U.S. power grid to 100% renewable energy is estimated to cost about $4.5 trillion over 10 years. So what's really clear from this trade-off is that instead of spending trillions of dollars on war for the past 2 decades, we could have already transformed our entire energy grid to be 100% renewable and had literally trillions of dollars left over. As the federal government increases military spending, they also prop up the power and influence of military corporations, which then use their influence and power to help draft policies that further their own profits. Nearly half of the military budget goes to contractors every year. And these contracts are incredibly lucrative. The CEOs of the top 5 contractors are paid a combined over $100 million per year. And we see a very similar situation panning out in the fossil fuel industry, where fossil fuel executives are making huge sums of money off of a business model that is literally destroying human life. The same goes for border security. A lot of the same corporations that have defense contracts are involved in border security and immigrant incarceration. And these corporations are making millions of dollars in profits to monitor, arrest, incarcerate, and deport people. So there's a lot of trade-offs for not only military spending, but just the budget priorities that we have that really don't align with the values that we want to put forth. We know that enforcing fair taxes on the wealthy, corporations, and Wall Street could yield $866 billion per year, which could be redistributed to other priorities. Ending direct and indirect subsidies for coal, oil, and gas could amount to another $649 billion. And we could redirect at minimum $350 billion from the Pentagon's current spending per year to achieve true security, end wars, reduce our aggressive posture overseas, rein in military contracts that are draining the public coffer for private gain, and actually increase our security as a nation. I think something that I think about a lot is that these enormous and just really unnecessary military expenditures have really warped our sense of what's possible and have tricked a lot of us into believing that we can't afford to improve our lives or keep the planet livable. But that's not the case. And the Pentagon is monopolizing a lot of the money that we need to meaningfully address the climate crisis. Finally, I want us to think about jobs. That's a really important part of this puzzle. The military and the fossil fuel industry, they mirror each other in that workers frequently end up funneled into the lethal work of both sectors due to limited options. And workers need a way out. Workers need a just transition. Like fossil fuel workers will need to transition into new jobs. There must be alternative pathways to good employment for individuals and communities whose livelihoods are tied to the military. Sometimes in the anti-militarism movements, this is talked about as the conversion movement. In the climate justice space, it's talked about more often as a just transition. But it's sort of a similar concept, and it's really critical in all of our conversations about changing paradigms that we consider the necessity to provide alternative pathways to good employment. Right now, the United States military is functioning as essentially the only major federal jobs program in the United States. But funding the green economy, for example, instead of military jobs, would actually be a net job creator. For the same level of spending, clean energy and infrastructure create over 40% more jobs, and energy efficiency retrofits create nearly twice the level of job creation. When we look at jobs in the care economy, things like teachers and social workers. Those create even a higher level of job creation for the same amount of spending. And those are also important jobs to consider when we talk about the just transition, because we need that kind of care infrastructure, and those are also very low carbon jobs. So starting to wrap up this portion of the presentation, in solidarity with the movement on the front lines of US militarism and climate injustice around the world, I want to conclude with some principles for collective action that can help inform our cross-movement organizing. All human life has equal value. Economies are only as healthy as people and the planet. All people have a right to self-determination. There is enough for everybody. We are all interconnected, and so are our movements. So with these principles for collective action in mind, we must pursue solutions to the climate crisis that are also at the same time challenging the violent and oppressive systems that have fueled both war and global warming for generations. What's next? I think we'll probably talk a little bit about this in the next portion of the presentation, but there's a lot of ways that we can start to organize around some of the issues that I've talked about in this presentation today. Right off the bat, if you visit nationalpriorities.org, you can download this report. I think the link might also be in the chat for folks. But we also have resources for advocates that break down some of the components and some of the intersections into smaller portions as well. So there is the Climate and Militarism report, and there's also some other resources for organizers, including a discussion guide. I want to encourage folks to just start off by hosting, right now it probably needs to be a virtual discussion on the intersections of climate change and militarism. We have a discussion guide up on our website. If you're working on in an anti-militarism space, I think a good next step is to find a climate justice organization that you can start to link up with, and vice versa. And I also want to encourage folks to write your local newspapers and start to sort of introduce some of this framing around other ways that we could be resourcing, or excuse me, other ways we could be allocating our resources that would actually keep our communities safe. Thanks. Wow, that was a whirlwind of information. Like I said, to download the report and for more information about the work that National Priorities Project does, you can visit our website. And please feel free to get in touch with me. There is my email, lorah@ips-dc.org. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you want to talk about movement building, or if you have ideas on how we could build on this work. I think, first of all, this moment that we're in right now has really demonstrated how Washington's militaristic budget priorities have really left our country very unprepared for a crisis. And we see that we're in for a lot more crises, maybe not the same as the one that we're experiencing now, but we know that in a climate change future, we will have more crises, we will have more disasters. This is what Naomi Klein has described as serial shocks. And we see that we're really not prepared to address these types of crises. And so I think that provides the opportunity for policy interventions that do provide an infrastructure of care and a social safety net for the types of shocks that we're in for in a climate change future. So I think that's one point. I think that it illustrates some of what's to come with the climate crisis. And if we sort of see this crisis as a dress rehearsal for the climate crisis and the many shocks to our system that are to come, we can see that we're really unprepared, and that we need to put a sort of very different infrastructure in place. I think your point about jobs is also really important. Some of the bad news of the lots of bad news that we're seeing right now is that we've seen hundreds of thousands of jobs in the clean energy sector have been lost. And so we're going to need some type of jobs program. We're definitely going to need a significant level of public investment to put people back to work. And so there's definitely an opportunity for organizers to ensure that the types of jobs that we're creating are clean energy jobs, care economy jobs, sort of mobilizing on a lot of the asks from groups like Sunrise that Nick is involved with that have been talking about related to public investment and job creation associated with the Green New Deal. So I think there's it's a good opportunity to, continue to organize around what a lot of climate justice groups have been talking about for years. But is maybe the necessity of it and the urgency of it is perhaps more visible to many than it has been.
What do you think about the recommendation to fund a Green New Deal by eliminating U.S. nuclear weapons?
I mean, I certainly think that that part of funding the Green New Deal can and should come from defunding the military, and that would include nuclear weapons programs. So I think that there's sort of been a missed opportunity at times. I know that it's not always the strategic objective to talk explicitly about how we're going to fund a Green New Deal. I know that that's a strategic choice, but I think sometimes there is also a strategic advantage to being able to point to the significant amount of resources that are currently in the military. And we've seen there's been some mobilization from progressive policymakers during the COVID crisis to redirect military funding to address the current public health crisis. So we have seen some leadership there more so than there has been at other times. So that's promising. In terms of specific proposals for cutting the military budget, last year, the National Priorities Project put out a moral budget with the Poor People's Campaign, and we came up with $350 billion that could be cut from the military annually. And I'll put the link to that moral budget in the chat, but in that report, we do lay out very specific cuts that could be made from the military to fund some of the other priorities that are put forth in the moral budget. In this moment, particularly with addressing the COVID crisis, but also in the face of the climate crisis, we need international cooperation. We need international sharing of resources. We don't need an adversarial, militaristic approach to international relationships. We need global cooperation and sharing. And so I think a part of that is really looking beyond a militaristic understanding of national security. And actually, instead of investing in militarism, we need to invest in international cooperation in order to develop global solutions to global problems. Something that I would like to direct people to is there's increasing levels of advocacy and public scholarship around having a global Green New Deal. And I think if we look at something like the intersections of climate and militarism, the urgency and necessity of having a global Green New Deal, globalized climate solutions is pretty apparent. Our partners that we work with at National Priorities Project at the LEAP just started a new project dedicated to a global Green New Deal. And there's other groups that have been working on this for a while. I know a couple good resources that I'll share in the follow-up materials.